Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Professor Michael Anderson. I am co-director with Professor Emerita Robin Ewing of the Create Centre. Thanks for joining us this afternoon on what's been, for I'm sure many of you, a really busy week. So thank you for taking the time to join us for what promises to be, I think, a really fascinating session. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal land, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I further want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you're on and pay respects to their elders, past, present and future. And if you want to acknowledge country that you're on, please feel free to do so in the chat box. Of course, it's NAIDOC week here in Australia for our Australian attendees, which serves to remind us of the enduring legacy and the future of Aboriginal culture. And so pleased that we are able to talk about that this week, but hopefully we continue to talk about the links between our Indigenous people and the critical role they have in our arts and creativity scene. So Create, as many of you know, is an organisation, a centre that is focused around research into arts and creativity, and also putting out information about arts and creativity. And when we started thinking about some of the things that we would like to share with our membership, the opportunity to look at an organisation such as A New Approach was kind of irresistible. The fit between what Create is attempting to do and the magnificent research that has been emerging from A New Approach has really, I think, enlivened many of the things that we've done. We've been citing it frequently in the kind of research and the grant applications we've been writing, and we've been talking about it in our teaching and research. And we thought that it would be a great idea, as it were, to hear it from the horse's mouth. Sorry for that invidious way of explaining who you are. But we thought it'd be great to hear from A New Approach, to hear about what they've done so far in a very short amount of time around talking about the arts and culture and how it engages with Australian society, but particularly its impact on Australian society. But also to think about how we might be able to engage with the kind of future that A New Approach is envisaging, and hear about their future plans as well. So we're really honoured to have Jodie-Lee Trembath and Kate Fielding with us today. Thank you both for your time this afternoon. And Kate, I'll hand it over to you and I'll stop talking.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. And I would like to say I'm so glad to be here with you today. I'm meeting with you from the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And I love horses. So I'm very happy to be described as it coming from the horse's mouth. So thank you. Hello, I am Kate Fielding. I'm the Program Director of A New Approach, and we see a future where Australia celebrates, benefits from, invests in arts, culture and creativity. We are, who are we? We are an independent think tank championing effective investment and return in arts and culture. What does arts and culture mean? Look, there's a chart. We know, of course, that the question of what is arts and culture is one of the most contested things in this space. And we have taken a broad and inclusive approach to what we mean by arts and culture. Now, when I say we, I am talking about A New Approach. A New Approach is a joint initiative of the three philanthropic organisations, the Maya Foundation, the Tim Fairfax Family Foundation, and the Kia Foundation. And the Australian Academy of Humanities is a lead delivery partner. Now today, we are going to be talking about, we're giving you a whirlwind tour, possibly at a gallop tour, to continue the horse metaphor, tour of our research work so far. So Jodie and myself will be talking about different parts of that work, and we'll of course have some opportunities for questions at the end. So we have released 5 reports. You can see the very handsome reports there on the screen. Those Insight Report series cover some really big themes, and we'll dive into some of those today. But what I think is really important to say at the outset is these are pieces of work that complement each other, that kind of collectively build an overview of arts, culture and creativity in Australia. And I've got to say, as someone who's worked in that space, in some cases, these are the pieces of the research pieces that I wish I had 5 years ago. These are the questions that I kept on hitting up against that I couldn't answer in my conversations with politicians, with the public, with businesses, that I wanted to be able to answer. So, at a gallop. The first report, the big picture. This looks at a single data set, cultural funding by government, and it looks at the themes over the last 11 years. What this data set is the best data set we have for investment by the 3 levels of government, right across those levels of government, but also across all different portfolios, not just those portfolios that are specific to arts and culture. And this report really came about because I couldn't find, everyone was claiming funding's going up, funding's going down. It's definitely the most it's ever been. It's definitely the worst it's ever been. And there wasn't actually a place that answered those questions. There were lots of claims, but no answers. So this report was really trying to get a basic set of numbers and a basic oversight of what's happening in this space. Now, there's a whole heap of insights that came out of that. And one of the really important ones that I really want to emphasize is that over the last decade, the relationship between the 3 levels of government in terms of their support for culture has shifted. This is really significant. So we've gone from federal government being 45%, the big player, to a much more even relationship between the 3 levels of government. Now, I take heart from this. I know, as I've lived most of my life in regional Australia, and the great thing about regional Australia is that you get to see that local government is one of the most accessible forms of government to a broad range of people, by which I mean people are going to bail you up in the supermarket and tell you what they really think. And what this shows us, what this change shows us, is that local government who have increased their per capita investment in arts and culture over this period by 11%. So while our population has been going up significantly, they've been also increasing their investment. They are seeing the value of arts and culture to the communities that they serve and who come and hassle them while they're doing their shopping. The other really important thing I'd like to share from this first up is that federal government and state and territory government invest in very different things, and that's partly to do with their different responsibilities. So you see on the left-hand side there, federal government, big focus on film, radio and television, and that of course covers the ABC and SBS. Also very significant focus on GLAM sector, so museum, archives, libraries and heritage, and a smaller focus on arts. On the right-hand side, you can see state and territory governments, very, very little focus on film, radio and television, and much more significant GLAM and arts. So the role of government, of different levels of government, is quite distinct. Now, we can come back to questions about that, but I'm going to hand over now to Jodie, who's going to talk about our next report.
Thanks, Kate. So there are a lot of claims about the benefits of arts, culture and creativity, and a lot of them tend to come from gut instinct, from lived experience, from anecdote, and that kind of evidence is really persuasive to people who already believe it to be true and people who have had those experiences themselves. it's less convincing to people who don't already believe it. And so with this report, we wanted to create a compendium of research that is already existing in the world that is conclusive about what arts and culture can do for society. And so we did that through putting together a literature review, and through that literature review, these 7 different themes emerged that you can see on the screen before you. I won't go through all of those, but I just wanted to take you through a couple of those really interesting findings, especially the ones that were surprisingly concrete. Slide, Kate, thank you. Okay, so the first of those that you can see there is that you can actually systematically design arts and cultural research, arts and cultural projects in order to have them build community and increase social cohesion. So when they're done right, and that involves extensive community consultation, doing it from the ground up, you can actually improve social cohesion, increase the empathy that community members have towards each other, increase feelings of belonging and inclusion. You can increase recovery efforts and improve recovery efforts after natural disasters or social crises such as COVID or our current recession, for example, that kind of thing. And it also increases the livability of areas as well. So not only for the people who live there, but also increasing the attractiveness to tourists. The second area that I wanted to talk about there was that arts and culture, this is vast and compelling evidence that arts and culture can increase physical and mental health outcomes. 2 studies that I wanted to talk about with you there. So the first is an Australian study from 2016, and it's the first of its kind. You might have already heard about it. I've heard that you guys have been doing quite a lot on the arts and health interaction. So that study was a world first dose response style study that found that doing 2 hours of arts and cultural participation per week could actually increase mental health and well-being amongst the general population. Really cool piece of research. And the second one that I wanted to talk about was an older study. It's a 2003 study that showed that participation in specific types of arts and culture could mitigate the risk of dementia. And so those were preliminary findings. Other studies have done follow-ups since then and found support for those findings. It's still preliminary, but it's really exciting and promising early research. And the third one that I wanted to talk about there was the evidence that we have that arts and culture can actually benefit learning outcomes. Again, 2 studies to talk about there. The first was an Australian study, very large scale study, thousands of students across 15 different schools. And in that study, the study found that students or people who engaged with arts and culture in their schooling years actually went on to have better self-esteem, better resilience. They had greater life satisfaction, higher levels of motivation, and they were able to bounce back from setbacks more effectively and faster. So again, quite a rigorous study, really interesting stuff. The other one there was a US-based study, and for that one, again, large scale study. This one was longitudinal. For those students who took an arts or culture-based elective during middle school, particularly grades 6 and 7, they found that those students had higher GPAs in that year and in ensuing years than their peers who didn't take arts and culture-based electives, irrespective of the GPAs that they had in elementary school. So again, quite compelling results. So the other thing that is interesting there about this study is that the way that we've structured it is to look at some of Australia's biggest challenges and say, okay, what can arts and culture do in this space? So for each of those themes, we outline some of those challenges and we talk about how they can be effectively addressed with arts and culture. I've listed a couple there. Australians feeling that society is broken, increases in the prevalence of dementia. We're dropping in a range of different international rankings. We hoped that by structuring the report that way, that we would make it easier for people who are writing grants or who wanted to be able to talk to their local members about particular areas that, that their work could be useful, that this would be a way that they could access that information. I'll hand back to Kate.
Thanks, Jodie. I'm going to talk about our next report, A View from Middle Australia. Now, this work looks at the perceptions of arts, culture and creativity amongst Middle Australians who were defined as middle-aged, middle-income swing voters in predominantly marginal federal electorates. We did research with them through focus groups, and we were so lucky. Do you remember that little moment between the bushfires and COVID? I think it was about 2 weeks. We had scheduled our focus groups around the country in those 2 weeks, and we were so lucky to be able to do this work right before, right in that little moment where it was possible. It's a fantastic work, fantastic report. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I'd really encourage you to have a look at it. It's very rich in quotes from those focus groups. It's really important to highlight with this work that we went into doing this research with a neutral stance. So we commissioned the work, and when we briefed the researchers, we said, we need you to go in a neutral way and actually explore the perceptions. We don't want you to go in and cherry pick. We don't want you to go in and find the good news. We actually need to know what this cohort thinks about this stuff. That's actually helpful and useful. And, you know, that's a very nerve-wracking thing, to be blunt about it. This is a very important cohort in thinking about Australia and our public policy settings. It's nerve-wracking to go tell us what you really think. I'm really pleased to share that what we found was incredibly encouraging. So Middle Australians think that arts and culture they're clear that it is important in their lives. They're clear that it's an essential part of being Australian and in fact being human. They're really focused on those opportunities to be together with their family and friends, and also to be extended to the connected to their extended community. And obviously that's been a very poignant finding in 2020. They're also flexible about what counts as arts and culture. And in the conversations, some of the things that were really interesting were, you know, I don't think TikTok in arts is arts and culture, but I know that it is for my children, and that's okay. So there wasn't a kind of policing of the boundaries. There was a real enthusiasm for a broad definition of arts and culture. And look, there's some beautiful, as I said, beautiful quotes throughout this, and I'd really encourage you to take a look at them. But there were 4 themes. Arts and cultural activities matter because they give us opportunities to be together and build community, because children need exposure to arts and culture to develop, because arts and culture stimulates creativity and broadens your mind, and because it helps build our national identity and represents Australia to the world. So these were really clear themes through across those focus groups, which were done in Townsville, Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, when in identifying what the value was. We didn't just want to know, do you value it, yes or no? We wanted to understand why, what was important about it to this cohort. And there were very clear messages there. I'm going to hand back now to Jodie.
Thanks, Kate. So Insight Report 4 was really born out of a desire to understand what's possible in the cultural policy space. And we did that by looking both at what Australia has done in the past and what Australia is doing now, and also what has happened around the world in the cultural policy space over the last 70 years. And by doing that, we discovered that there were 4 key themes that emerged, and that therefore these were the drivers that policymakers had motivating them for creating cultural policy. You can think of cultural policy drivers sort of as the purpose that policies have for arts and culture to serve within society. And so those those 4 cultural policy drivers allowed us to create a framework that we hope can allow the different stakeholders within the arts and cultural space to be able to have more productive conversations with each other where they're using a common language. Slide. Thank you. So these are those 4 cultural policy drivers, and I'll take you through each one, and I'll give you an example from the last 70 years in Australia that allows you to see how different governments at different levels, federal, state and territory and local, have been driven by these drivers. So the first is collective identity, and the idea of collective identity as a driver is to say that the purpose of arts and culture is to unite disparate individuals around the things that they have or can be said to have in common, even when there are other things that they don't have in common. And a good example of this comes from the bicentennial celebrations in Australia in the 1980s. This was a time when federal and the various state governments came together to collaborate using arts and cultural events and venues to really unite Australia around the idea of diversity. And it seems like those projects and those events during that time were designed through storytelling to reflect a multicultural Australia back to itself. It's also worth noting with collective identity as a driver that it doesn't have to be a national identity that we're talking about. It's any time that you have a group of people where arts and culture are being used to unite them around an idea. So state governments use it, local governments use it to help residents to see themselves as part of a collective whole. The second one there is reputation building, and the reputation building driver is based around the idea that arts and culture can help either individuals or institutions or countries to build reputation with both internal and external stakeholders. So an example there comes from local government. So the Toowoomba Regional Council in Queensland found themselves with a problem. They had decreasing civic pride and increasing incidents of graffiti. And so to address that challenge, they partnered up with creatives from their town to devise a festival called the First Coat Mural Festival. And that festival brought street artists in from both from Toowoomba, from around Australia, but also from international environment, street artists from around the world, brought them to Toowoomba, and over the course of 3 days, they created these incredible murals on the sides of buildings. And people came from around Australia to watch them create those amazing murals. And it really was very effective for the Toowoomba Regional Council in increasing their own reputation with their constituents, but also increased the reputation of Toowoomba with externals through tourism as well. The third one there is social improvement, and the social improvement driver says that arts and culture is, the purpose of it is to improve social outcomes in society. Probably the best example there from recent years is the way that arts and culture have started to be used in disaster recovery. For example, the Victorian government developed a strategy following the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009 that used arts and culture to help communities not only to build back their infrastructure, but also to rebuild their resilience. And the fourth one there is economic contribution, which obviously is the purpose of arts and culture is to contribute to the economy, just like any other industry sector. And an example of this comes from the Create in New South Wales policy framework, particularly where that policy document takes arts and culture, partners it with tourism, and talks about how together they provide economic opportunities for New South Wales. And a particular quote there says that arts and culture are an increasingly key part of Sydney's visitor economy. They talk about in that strategy how Arts New South Wales the Regional Arts Network and Destination New South Wales should be all working together in order to promote cultural tourism, because cultural tourists, particularly cultural and heritage visitors, spent $8.3 billion in New South Wales in 2013, the year that they had the most recent research for. So it's important to recognise that that those 4 policy drivers exist in most cultural policy documents, and that has a range of different consequences, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But for now, I'll hand back to Kate.
Thanks, Jodie. We are going to talk now about our most recent report, and it was also released early as a working paper. I'm guessing that some of the people here would be aware that there's a parliamentary inquiry going on into cultural and creative institutions and industries, and we released that working paper in September to try and assist people in preparing their submissions to that inquiry. Now, this, I'm going to just talk about a couple of the key findings out of this report. It's a huge, rich and very diverse take on this. So I'd really encourage you to dive into that. And my favourite thing, it's got lots of charts. If Jodie is probably sick of me saying, is there any way that we can show that in a chart? Let's try and do that. So let's have a look at one of those first charts. So this takes the big picture, the big approach to the cultural and creative economy, recognises the cultural and creative industries as a part of that. And you can see there on the left-hand side, breaks down what those cultural and creative industries are. This is the standard definition that is used in Australia. And this report really maps what those different elements are. We hear that $111 billion, that 6.4% contribution to the whole economy, a lot. And it's attributed to a whole heap of different things. We wanted to really step out what those figures mean, what they're referring to when we talk about them, to assist people in making more convincing and credible claims around the impact of the cultural and creative economy. Similarly, with the cultural and creative workforce, again, a very important issue at the moment in Australia and indeed probably around the world. You'll see here in this chart, it really lays out what those different parts of the cultural and creative economy are, the workforce within those. So most often we hear that cultural and creative industries workforce, about 650,000 people, 6% of the entire workforce in Australia working in cultural and creative industries. And as we narrow down that scope and pick up particular parts of those cultural and creative industries, you can see there about 1.8% in the arts and entertainment workforce, about 33,000 people, so 0.3% of the total workforce in that much narrower category of creative and performing arts. Of course, one of the questions that I think we all have is that understanding how investment in arts, culture and creativity provides a range of public and private benefits and how it impacts on other parts of our industry, of our economy. And so this is working, drawing from the work of Holden, creating a graphic there that really tries to explain in a systems way what that subsidy of arts and cultural access can do, and that investment in innovation in creating, how that relates to other parts and influences in a positive way other parts of our economy. Now, this report is huge. I'd encourage you to take a good look at, again, particularly the charts. It's a beautifully designed piece of work. And you can find all those reports, and if you're not on our mailing list, you can sign up there. The details there on the screen. I'm going to hand back to Thomas. I know we're going to, oh, sorry, Michael. I'm going to hand back to both of you, and we'll have some time now for questions that we are going to answer. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kate. The first question was just from a member of the audience, the just wanted to see that slide where the names of the studies were listed with the authors, so they can presumably check them out in their own time. It's fascinating work, and thank you so much for making it available. I presume it's all sort of freely available on the website, and yeah, fascinating things. So my first question was really about, you were sort of talking about the current review into arts funding and support from the federal government. I was wondering whether you had seen your research in action yet, and whether you could talk a little bit about that, and has it informed any arts advocacy or any government decisions perhaps?
Absolutely. So the parliamentary inquiry has its first set of hearings tomorrow, and I'm really pleased to share that we're doing the opening address tomorrow morning.
Oh, fantastic, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It's really pleasing. So obviously we made a submission and drew heavily on this work, but what's been really pleasing is across the 300 submissions that were made to that inquiry, our work is quoted and referred to extensively. And what's even more exciting is some of the key ideas that we've been suggesting as solutions that might like to be picked up at a federal level are visible throughout a number of those submissions. In terms of the impact of this work, we know that it's being used within federal government. We know it's being used at a whole range of different levels for government and informing policy work there. But what's also really pleasing is we can see that broadly within the cultural and creative sector, that people are using this material to inform their decisions, particularly inform strategies around response to COVID. We know that people are using this to help them understand what the opportunities are for them and where the difficult points might be.
And what are some of the proposed solutions you've put forward?
Sure. So in our submission to the parliamentary inquiry, we talk about three things. One's a short-term response and two medium-term. We've been talking about the need for a national arts, culture and creativity plan modelled on the Sports 2030 plan. The Sports 2030 plan is a federal plan, a national plan that was released in 2018, and it really successfully has positioned the bipartisan principles that are recognised in terms of the role that sport plays in our community, the role of participation, the role of ambition, the role of commercial activity within sport, and the importance of people having access and opportunities to strive for excellence. That was done through a process that drew, of course, within the sports industry, but also more broadly within the Australian public to understand the role that sport plays in their lives. And I think it's a great model for how we could take an updated 21st century approach to this space to make sure that a rich cultural life that is relevant is available to Australians right across the country. We also talk there in that submission about an inquiry from the Productivity Commission. There are some sector-specific issues, some industry-specific issues that I think really would be well served through a fresh look at those. Obviously, there's a range of different issues in terms of copyright, in terms of intellectual property, but also in terms of changing modes of production and distribution. And these are rapidly changing spaces, and we need to have an approach there that really considers whether our legislative settings, whether our policy settings, whether our investment settings are match fit in the 21st century.
And were they that was all three, the medium term and the two short term ones?
Those, thank you. So the one, thank you.
Just to prove I'm listening, you know.
Yeah, it's good. In terms of the short term recommendation we've made there, we recognise that it's been a really tough year for many people across many different spaces. We recognise that the arts, culture and creativity space has been particularly hard hit during COVID, and particularly for those parts of that industry that rely on people gathering, that is going to continue to be the case for a little while yet. And so we've also seen, of course, incredible innovation, the dreaded word pivoting, a whole heap of change that has been made at rapid pace to try and keep producing, keep servicing, keep connecting. And so we're suggesting that in next year's budget, the federal government could look at some specific programs around that transformation process and picking up some of the models that have been developed and really ramping them up, investing in them to really see how what a with COVID life, and you know, hopefully we'll get to a post-COVID life, but I think we've got a with COVID life for a while. What models are going to serve and ensure that we can keep having a rich cultural life?
There's a question from Luella McCarthy who says, thank you for a great presentation. And I should add, if there's anyone that has any questions, just feel free to pop them in the chat box and I'll pass them on. So Luella had two questions. The first one, I guess it's a yes or no question. Do you think the current federal government is welcoming in this space? And the second question is, how does this work fit with the Australia Council and its current role?
Excellent, thank you. So I take real hope from this parliamentary inquiry and real hope from the Creative Industries Task Force that has been established. I think there are strong indications that the federal government is looking to have a serious assessment of the current policy settings and are looking for solutions in how to improve this space. So mate, I think my answer there, the first question is yes. In terms of our role of the Australia Council, so the Australia Council is a statutory authority. I stepped off their board to take up this role. So their scope is as a funding body and an advisory body to government. They are an entity of government and their scope is quite specifically within creative arts. We work with the Australia Council. We obviously do have a lot of conversations about our respective research programs and really make sure that we are aware of what each other are doing. Our scope is substantially broader than theirs. So at a simple answer, in terms of a research focus, their research scope is relatively focused on those creative arts. Ours takes in the broader screen, glam sector, creativity.
I just wanted to pick up on that point you were making about, I guess, the federal government's willingness to, I guess, step in at this particular time, at this particular moment in history. One of the things that I'm doing in my other life as a theatre maker is applying for the government's RISE grant. And one of the requirements of that grant is that we can demonstrate the creation of jobs and economic impact around the local area of the project that we're proposing, which is difficult to find data on, basically. It's not necessarily difficult to assess, but it's very difficult to find this sort of coherent and, I guess, credible data on that sort of thing. And I guess without, you know, if you could help me out, that'd be great. If you've got some sort of figure or algorithm, that'd be wonderful. But I wonder if you could talk about any research you've done in that area, because clearly a lot of the research you've done is about the overall economic impact of arts funding and arts activities. But do you have any sort of, like, I guess within the local area, the locus of arts activities, what kind of economic activity you see being driven?
So what we've tried to do within that economic report is kind of map the examples of what you could use to demonstrate that. And there are some figures within there. We can pick that conversation up afterwards and we'll direct you to the exact pages to use that might be specifically useful to you. But look, it is one of the most difficult things. There's not a magical algorithm, sorry, for Australia. Depending on what it is that you're doing, there are some examples internationally that that kind of do a version of it. Most of them are events-based though, so it is one of the real challenges.
And just to pick up on that international focus, it seems like much of the reporting is about Australia, but do you do comparative analysis in terms of, I guess, funding environments at sort of the very least? Yeah. Yeah,
so the first report did some analysis of, in the first report we did some analysis of the OECD members and how Australia, our cultural investment matches up with other OECD members, and we're definitely below average in that space. The details again are in that report, but from memory, I think we come in at about 26th out of 32. So there's room for improvement.
And what are some of the successful countries doing in that report? Oh, sorry, in that space.
Yeah. One of the things that I will also add there, though, in terms of those international comparisons, we actually have a really high participation rate in arts and culture. When we look at the comparative data for Europe, when we look at the comparative data for the UK, Australians have a really high participation rate in arts and culture, which I think is often surprising, or people find surprising. But I think we're secretly a nation of arts and cultural lovers. Who'd have thunk it? In terms of those international comparisons, who's doing it well? In the policy report, we looked at some of those countries who had taken a deliberate policy approach in this area. So places like South Korea, who have deliberately invested in arts and culture, particularly with a focus on building their international reputation, building their global reach. That's quite exceptional. Japan, the UK are kind of standouts there. I also like to point to Indonesia, who have a real focus on creative industries at the moment. That's an emerging thing over the last couple of years, but builds on a really rich arts and cultural practice there. So we're in a neighbourhood where many nations are looking at taking different approaches, but more consistently taking a strategic approach to that whole cultural and creative space.
And there was a slide in one of your reports, which I found quite interesting. It was one of the early ones about the share of federal government funding in relation to state and local governments. I was curious, the shares, the federal government funding had shifted and been reduced, but I'm wondering whether that was a shrink in overall funding or just an increase in local funding, just to clarify.
Great question. So bear with me, it's a slightly complicated answer.
Not maths, not more maths.
I love maths. So it's both. So there's been a per capita drop in federal, a per capita increase in local, and a slight per capita, a slight increase in state and territory. The bulk of that drop at a federal level is within that screen, so film, television, radio.
Right. There's just another question.
But to be really clear, that's on a per capita basis. And it's important to remember in that time, I think from memory, our population's gone up by 16%. The issue that we're seeing there is that our investment into this space is not keeping up with our population. Sorry, there's a question.
And not keeping up with demand, would you say?
I think that as our population grows, there's increased demand, but there's also more complex demand. I think that there's an expectation that arts and culture, and rightly so, will be accessible and relevant to the broad range of people within our society. So whilst it's not keeping up with demand, but probably not also keeping up with the complexity of demand.
There's a question here in the chat box from someone, not sure who, asking if you could talk a little bit about how you selected the studies for inclusion in the reports. For example, the wellbeing and educational sections of report 2.
I'm going to hand that one to Jodie. You're right to take that, Jodie?
Absolutely. So what we were aiming for there was a systematic literature review. However, what we ended up with, because we determined that a lot of the literature in this space is actually grey literature, and that's actually the literature that's really most persuasive to policymakers a lot of the time. So we wanted to cover off on both the academic and the grey literature in this space. So we were using the databases, using a set of keywords that then brought about a subset of those particular types of articles. It was a massive undertaking, as you can imagine. We started off by looking at the, oh goodness, I've blanked on the name of it, but it was a very, very large study in the UK, which I will put the name in the comments in a moment, because they have actually undertaken this sort of work in the past, taking a UK-centric approach. So we used that as a starting point, and then we snowballed out from there. And then from that developed our set of themes, and then from those themes undertook our literature review within the databases and then using Google. Is that the kind of answer? Sorry, you're right, that person has a student number.
Julie Dunn here from Griffith University.
Hi, Julie.
I'm sorry, it came up because I'm using a work computer. It came up as my staff number, so I wasn't trying to be incognito. I just realised it was named. Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason I'm interested is there's some really big Australian studies that we would think are really important, especially in education, and also some small ones, and also, you know, there's been quite a lot of work done in dementia. So I'm kind of interested in the silences as well as the inclusions. And I think, I guess my other question is that education and the arts is so important, and it's, you know, I'm wondering if there's a chance, Robin's question is where to next. I'm wondering if there's a chance that you might actually tackle some of those bigger topics in more detail.
Do you want to take that one, Kate?
Sure. Look, it's obviously, all of these topics have enormous depth to them, enormous breadth. We're really aware that there's really rich work around arts and education, and really rich work around arts and health. Our guiding principle is always around what the gap is, where there are gaps, what's not being done, as well as what's needed. So certainly it's really great to hear that there are some pieces of work that you think are really substantial, that we could have a further look at. And certainly thank you for talking about the need for that education piece is really important.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Julie. I was just sort of curious about the study that Jodie-Lee was talking about art dosages. Am I getting that right? And I'm just wondering whether, or what your view is on, I guess, justification of arts funding into the future being, I guess, tied to health and well-being or even education outcomes, and how much of your research, I guess, is devoted perhaps to just sort of art for art's sake, to use a kind of fairly tired cliche.
Thanks. So what we really tried to do in that policy drivers piece was lay out that that arts and culture and the policies around them, that there's a range of different priorities and purposes, and that at different times, different governments are going to prioritise different things. So whilst we go, there's an inherent importance there's an inherent public role that arts and culture plays, there's an inherent public value role that it plays, and therefore it requires public investment for that purpose. There's a range of other public roles that it plays in terms of arts, culture, health, where there's probably opportunities for increased utilisation of that in Australia.
Can I add to that? Is that okay? One of the things that we tried to do with Insight Report 3, or actually, let me rephrase that. One of the things that came out of the findings in Insight Report 3 was that the Middle Australians that were part of those focus groups seemed to be leaning towards arts and culture as a public good. They didn't say it like that, but by unpacking how to define a public good, we were able to then map some of those themes out of the report to the idea of public value and public good. And from that, we were able to actually say to policymakers, it seems to us from these findings, from this evidence, that actually there is a strong feeling amongst the average Australian member of the public that there is intrinsic value to arts and culture. And again, it's a little bit like what I was saying with Insight Report 2, that when you have an inherent belief in the intrinsic value of arts and culture, and somebody presses you as to why, the answer is because it's important, it's intrinsic, it's hard to explain. And so what we are trying to do in all of our various reports is find the hooks, find the aspects, the criteria that we can, that will bridge that gap between an idea that feels right and is so close to our hearts, and find the hooks that we can then connect those ideas to the kind of language that policymakers use and to the kind of language that people who don't believe in it use as well.
And in that report on Middle Australia, it seems that, I mean, and sort of the point you were just making, there's fairly widespread support for the arts in principle. It just needed to be mapped onto sort of, I guess, more concrete findings. Mm. But why is it, do you think, that the arts are perhaps perceived as a niche issue, or, you know, even sort of thinking who the thunk that Australians consume a lot of art? You know, why are we still criticising Malcolm Turnbull for being at the opera and so on? You know, like, what is, have you done any research into that, for example?
So the very clear finding out of that Middle Australia piece was that if we just talk about arts, it is perceived generally as elitist, and that Middle Australia generally, from these focus groups, perceive it as not for them. So there are particular art forms that are not considered accessible or relevant. When we talk about arts and culture, that opens this space up a lot more, and that starts to take in the full range of artistic and cultural participation that cohort value and see as important as part of their lives. So I think there's a really rich opportunity there for us to recognise the breadth of arts and cultural participation that is relevant across Australia and talk about that. If we remain in talking just about arts and in a very specific set of art forms, then it will remain a niche issue.
And one other thing that came out of that piece of research also was that place was really important and space was really important. So a lot of the time, as you might expect, the participants were saying things like, oh, opera or ballet, not for me. But actually, when pressed on what that feeling was about, it was about not feeling like those spaces were welcoming to people like me, and that the art forms themselves, for example, going to see Cirque du Soleil and hearing operatic vocals in that, loved it. Ballet performed in a festival, loved it. So Symphony in the Park, that was a huge one. I mean, that sells out every year in Queensland. So the spaces themselves were really important. And when the participants felt comfortable in their environment, then they were much, much more open to the idea of different art forms as well.
And I will pick up on that. A really interesting theme throughout the research was the importance of doing things together. So often I think when we talk about this, we get quite focused on art forms. Do people like things or not? And actually it was about the experience. And there was one, I'll share one little moment out of the focus group. There was one conversation about whether films were or weren't arts and culture. And there was a conversation about how if you watch a film at home by yourself, it's not arts and culture, but if you watch the same film in the cinema with your friends, it is. And that's the best example I can give of the idea about do people value this, yes or no, an art form question. It's kind of missing the point for this cohort, that it's actually about the experience of doing things with people that was central to their definition of an art cultural experience.
I just have one last question, and that was just to sort of return to the present moment. Have you accounted for the money that the government has used to support, the federal government has used to support the arts during COVID-19? And despite the fact that it's temporary, do you think it's having an impact? And if you could sort of give us your assessment of the state of things at the moment, that would be really great, maybe to take us home.
Sure. So in terms of those figures that we're looking at before, they're from 2017-18, which is the most recent figures that have been released for that big data set. So I'm going to re-emphasize that cultural funding by government data set is the piece that captures all the investment from regional development, from education, from veterans affairs, that broad cross-portfolio investment. In terms of the current response, I think, given my background in regional arts, I'm really pleased that one of the first investments was into the Regional Arts Fund, and that, of course, has got out the door really quickly. I think that's a real fantastic outcome, and very much was focusing one of the places where there was significant need. I'm obviously aware that the arts and culture is one of the few industries that have got a dedicated, arts and entertainment are one of the few industries that have got a dedicated package. And I think there's been a real public and significant engagement from the federal government in getting their head around an industry that has been disproportionately impacted, and trying to have a material response to that. Possibly from a place where it wasn't, they didn't start from a position of it being self-evident that that was required.
So I lied before, this is actually the last question. Can you tell me what's next for you and your organisation? Yeah,
so we are, as I said, my head is very much in the fact that we are doing the parliamentary inquiry tomorrow.
Good luck from all of us here at Create.
Thank you. I do encourage you to check it out. You can listen to it online if you're as nerdy as that, or read the transcripts which will be up. I think it's going to be a really, really interesting set of conversations.
Brilliant. Robin, would you like to say the concluding remarks?
Sure, thanks Thomas. That's been really informative and great, even when we've read the reports, to hear, you know, the conversation around it and the purpose of what's happening. I think it's been fabulous. We do wish you well for the parliamentary inquiry and the bigger picture in terms of what that parliamentary inquiry is going to find and deliver and recommend. But, you know, as Michael said at the beginning, there's, a lot of resonance between the kind of work that you're doing and what Create is working on too. So let's hope we can continue these conversations and certainly extend the understanding of the importance of arts and culture for all Australians. I was really interested in the comments around Middle Australia and their view of the arts, and there are so many things that you found that will be really important to drill down further in. So well done, and many, many thanks for this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks very much to you both. And I'm just going to put the Create membership link in the chat box. So if you haven't yet become a member of the Create Centre, you should definitely become one. It's free, and we program several events like this throughout the year, and this will also be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. Thanks very much to A New Approach, and see you next time.
Thanks everyone.
See you later.